Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Good morning, Ambassador Thigo. Thank you so much for joining us on Voices of Africa today, our podcast by Africa Practice. It's not the first time that the two of us are speaking, but I'm really excited about this conversation this morning. So thank you. Thank you very much. I've had the pleasure of speaking to you, of meeting you on different occasions, but someone in our audience might be less familiar with you and your background. So I'd love to start just by inviting you to tell us a little bit about your background. You are currently the Special Envoy on Technology in the Office of the President of Kenya. But before your appointment, just about a year ago, your career path was quite diverse and, may I say, colorful. You've worked in civil society, in the startup ecosystem, but you've also worked for the UN and many other public offices. How did you find your way to your current appointment, and how do these different experiences shape the way you understand and interpret your role in your current office?
No, thank you so much, Marie, for the invitation. I think part of where I landed today, I think was very much around being very iterative. Of course, I started my career, as you can imagine, in technology, thinking that I'd probably end up in somewhere around banks or a big tech company. But I think it was important to think about how technology could begin to influence some of the areas where we had the greatest challenges. And so I think my career path, whether through civil society, where I started from an international organization perspective around building capacity of civil society, to more engage and collaborate, especially at the policy and advocacy level, but also to begin to build capacity of civil society leaders to understand the current trends, challenges, and prospects around governance and engagement and international relations. So I think technology and data becomes quite interesting, especially at that time where the world was very much still new around the internet. And think over time, having left civil society international organization, I think it was important for me as a lesson to think about how to ground a lot of these things. Because when you talk at the international level, you really rely a lot on grassroots organizations, and then you realize that it's very hard to contextualize a lot of these conversations. And so I think for me, it was important to think about being very grounded. So I came back into the country to figure out how these forces that operate at the international level actually change or affect people at the grassroots level. And so I think it was important to sort of do that. And so I came back, figured out maybe a startup was the best potential place to start, because at that particular time, it was very hard to get resources from very much around the usual foundations around technology. And so being able to put up a startup around civic tech, being able to collaborate with friends around building technologies that help citizens basically engage in governance, whether it's to call for public service delivery or budget tracking. And then I realized actually then policy was actually an interesting bit where the policy never understood technology. And I think then I somehow found my way into sort of early days of public service, but very much at the continental level, which is quite interesting. And then, of course, full circle came back into academia, because then it was quite interesting that capacity across the board seemed to be a challenge. And so I think it was important for me to figure out how to work with existing educational institutions to build capacity, especially around technology fluency, but also technology started changing very quickly. So how do you ensure that academic institutions and research centers understand these new trends? Of course, again, automatically I found myself in diplomacy, because then even as I was engaging in research and academia and building capacity, I found it interesting that technology was moving very quickly, and it became a subject of contestation. And so we needed something new. And increasingly, this role of mine is something very new that recognizes, one, technology is an issue of contestation, but also geopolitics. It's important to have African voices in this geopolitics. I think the second part, of course, was diplomacy now increasingly, especially after COVID-19, as you know, required a lot of use of digital tools. So how do you ensure that policymakers can use these tools themselves to engage in public diplomacy? The third part, of course, is beyond the topics. It's yes, the tools, the geopolitics, but also the topics. We have more than 50 topics and increasing that is being negotiated, whether it's regional, national, or international level, whether it's quantum, whether it's AI, whether it's data governance. And so I end up in this space where now I'm trying to work with colleagues in the front line to ensure that these 50 topics are very nuanced around being grounded, using on my previous experience, so that policy making is evidence-driven, but also reality-driven.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And I've been really fascinated to see how you have made the digitization of government, as well as this educational component that you just spoke to, so front and center of your work. And I'm familiar with the handbook that your office has recently developed for your diplomats. Thank you so much for also making it available. Can you tell me a little bit about more what inspired that? You've just spoken about 50 different negotiations that are happening globally. You've spoken about the need to ensure that our policymakers understand technology and are comfortable engaging in those discussions. What are the challenges there, but also what are winning approaches that you have that you've been able to experiment with and find in your first year?
That's quite interesting. I think for me it came out of necessity. Basically, it's not rocket science, and I'm being very candid about this. I found myself, especially last year, that artificial intelligence, and data governance was very much right front center in almost every global discussion and every capital in the world. And so it became very hard for me to try to fly into all those capitals because my competence and capacity was required. And so I think it just was obvious, based on my engagement with diplomats, is to then think about how do you make this scale very quickly, but also how do we empower diplomats themselves with capacity to be able to engage on their own without necessarily trying to find where Philip is. I mean, it's virtually impossible for one human being, especially last year and increasingly even this year, to cover almost 5 or 6 capitals of the world that are somehow negotiating or engaging on digital diplomacy. And so I think the playbook became very important, and that's why we designed a playbook and not curriculum, nothing else. So the playbook, I think, was very much my thinking around ensuring that people have the tools that they can, first of all, be very fluency was the biggest deal. So how can they be fluent around these new and emerging technologies and the topics? How can they, for example, have the right language, engaging by themselves? Because diplomats understand the language. And so we co-created it with a couple of young diplomats in our missions in Geneva, Addis, and New York, and LA. And so I think for me it was very important to have that book in their hands, and it keeps on evolving. So our playbook, as you know, is a living document. So how do you ensure that even as the topics change, we continue to update it based on how things are moving? So I think that was basically the basis of the playbook. And I think for me then, if you think about last year, the world was negotiating the global digital compact. And so if you think about Kenya being part of Group of 77 and China, so that's how we negotiate in the UN. Then it's important to have, yes, the playbook for Kenya, but also release it for the other countries so that when they're negotiating, at least they have the language, and then they can contextualize it based on their historical engagement around these issues. And so I think for me, that's really the basis of that. And so I think education for me continues to be a core element in these topics. And for me, education is not nuanced around our usual curriculum. It has to be agile. It has to be around lifelong learning. It has to be around having a global mindset. It has to be around being just fluent on these issues. You do not necessarily have to be competent. And I tell a lot of people that you do not necessarily have to understand the weeds of data science or machine learning or deep learning algorithms, but you just need to understand the basics so that you can engage in a more meaningful way.
I'll definitely come back to some of those keywords that you just mentioned: agility, global mindset, lifelong learning. Very much very close to my heart. But before that, I'd love to pick up on this issue of making it available to the rest of the continent. Does Africa need its own playbook? Do we need a collective playbook as the continent?
I think we do, and if you think about us having a continental AI strategy, because the continental AI strategy gives you basically the aspiration or the principles that Africans need to engage around artificial intelligence, or this is sort of the irreducible minimums that we have if we're engaging with other regions. So yes, I think we need our own playbook. I think from the get-go is that AI, as you know, or emerging technologies currently is with a few companies and a few countries. And if you look at the few companies and the few countries, we definitely have a lot of differences, especially around values and principles. A lot of those regions come from their own understanding. For example, Europe will come from a heavy understanding of human rights, and they come from data governance, data protection. So that there's that being pushed from Europe. In China, of course, we know it's about influencing and how that works. In the US, is very much around the companies that are driving adoption and use of technology. And so if you look at the three areas, we are closer to all of those regions, but from very specific touch points. 54 countries in a continent that is very diverse, of course, aspires or connects with these values in very different ways. And so I think for me, having a playbook, for example, is important. And if I take Kenya, for instance, we of course are very big on inclusivity. So you do not necessarily see that in a lot of regions, because inclusivity in a way is very much an anomaly in a market, in a place of capitalism where it's about profit. So profit sometimes doesn't necessarily understand inclusivity. And so I think for us, inclusivity is a big deal, and this requires a very Afrocentric approach to it. Issues around sustainability, not many of these countries agree to the extent that technology also is creating a lot of challenges around climate. And so being an African continent that is always at the forefront of climate change, then I think sustainability for us is a big deal. The third part, of course, is this whole notion of building public trust. A lot of these countries either are democratic or undemocratic, or there are now new challenges around safety or misinformation or disinformation, or how we understand this concept within our governance frameworks. And so I think for me, with that, within the African continent, of course, for us, we understand the sort of ambitions that we have and the challenges that technology can create on our democracy and the democratic fabric. So safety is a big deal for us, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes, and synthetic content. And so I think we need our own playbook that speaks to these values in a very more nuanced way. That is very African. Of course, we know that the models as they exist, for example, are devoid of African languages or dialects. And so when you hear bias, for example, we need then our own playbook that we understand issues around mitigating bias. We really understand issues around low resource languages. We understand fair data compensation. We understand multilingual data sets. And I think that contextual proposal is very much an Afrocentric way. And so, yes, we need an Africa playbook.
Yeah, and especially when we speak about low resource languages, multilingual models, as you just mentioned, it's actually not an individual country's position, because we hold those resources jointly.
Yes.
Particularly when it comes to our languages, our cultures, they don't stop at one border. So as a consequence, the ownership isn't. So you've already touched on the AI strategy, the continental AI strategy. Sovereignty, transparency, inclusivity, sustainability are the four principles that really run through. And we said that's what we want our AI future to be. That's what we want our digital future to be. So how can we then, as 54 countries, unpack that further? And particularly the notion around sovereignty as well as moving together. As you've just said, we need all countries to move together on certain decisions, on certain positions, particularly when it comes to making resources, data, but also other resources available. And then I would go even a step further. You've just spoken about sustainability. We know that the energy is needed, the energy will need to come from somewhere. And even in that field, we are most likely looking at a joint infrastructure to a certain extent. So how can we, as 54 countries, come together and unpack that further?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you look at, and this is something that I'm always grappling with around trying to explain to people that we need to redefine or reimagine what sovereignty is in the era of emerging technologies. And so if you look at sovereignty today, the understanding, I have a sense there's a loss in translation because people are taking the classical sense of sovereignty and then replicating that within the era of emerging technology. I think for me, sovereignty really, and I define it as independence in the age of interdependence. So it's not about you being independent and creating your own silo or your own island. Is figuring out what are these basics, guardrails that protect your data, your ecosystems, but within the notion of interdependence, because not one country or one region in this age of emerging technologies can do this alone, right? So that for me is the difference. And so it's very much then, or must be an African sort of principle that when you think about sovereignty, it's not about Kenya or the big countries being able to have everything in their country and then protecting it within walls. It's about how do you ensure that whatever critical resource around emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence, whether it's compute, whether it's talent, whether it's data, or whether it's the use cases, that yes, they're sovereign, but then they are shared. And for me, the sharing of this means that they must be within a certain framework, whether it's ethical framework, whether it's data protection, whether it's independence in a way that it's not basically predatory, the way that we see the current frameworks evolve. So I think for me, that's something that I always want to double down on. And so I think as an African continent, we need to think in that way. So not every country needs to build compute because not all of us can build compute. And to your point, not every country has enough energy resources to power this very hungry technology. And so the notion of sovereignty must be challenged beyond the national borders to a notion of continental sovereignty in a way that it's interdependent. And so the interdependence for me, for example, we can have shared data infrastructure, we can have shared compute, we can have shared talent, because unfortunately very few countries have the talent capacity to sort of power this revolution, but also because you're competing with other big tech companies. But also, let's not forget that Africa has a very large diaspora community. And so the diaspora community, for me, for instance, can lend their capability from wherever they are and support building very niche capabilities within the continent.
I love that concept. Reimagine sovereignty, definitely a slogan that we need to take forward, as well as this notion of independence in the age of interdependence. You've just spoken about the shared compute infrastructure and the shared data infrastructure. Kenya has played quite a critical role in recent months in terms of enabling some of our first steps as a continent, particularly when it comes to compute infrastructure. What are the next steps that we should be expecting as a continent, and what are the next steps that we maybe not yet expecting, but that we really need to double down on?
I think we still haven't figured out, what to expect, of course, is sort of a doubling down on investments around compute, because at the moment it's the one resource that the continent does not have. And so, of course, working very closely with, I'm working basically with everybody, whether it's Oracle, whether it's Microsoft, or recently, and the most promising one, Cassava Technologies with the AI Factory. We are now starting to see these capabilities being very close to home. So I think that hurdle has been crossed. Last year, we were not where we are today in terms of even access. So last year, for example, we were nowhere in line to access GPUs, especially the ones that are meaningful and could help develop serious AI capabilities. So this year, I think we are far much closer than we would have been before. What we need to double down on, those are the core elements, right? So if we have compute, that's fine, but what about talent and the talent pipeline? And I'm not talking about just talent that is very much focused on developing AI capabilities, but talent across the entire ecosystem. Because AI by itself will not solve anything. We need doctors who know how to use these capabilities. We need mathematicians, we need teachers, we need people in the food systems, we need manufacturers, right? We need people in business, especially our nascent private sector, to be able to harness or leverage AI. So I feel that's the talent pool we've not been building very well. We've been focusing a lot on the technology talent. We need to build talent across the entire value chain. We also need to build research capabilities, because really our research and development capabilities are still not very much at par with a lot of these other regions. So if you're looking at where these new models are coming from, for example, they're coming from labs, right? Whether it's the DeepSeeks, whether it's OpenAI, whether it's Mistral or Cohere, or even in UAE with Falcon, it's very much around a research and development sort of environment. So we need to build our R&D capacity, and that means African governments need to live up to their promise of investing at least a percentage of their GDP on research and development, but also we need to collaborate more. So it's just not about government, it's also the other existing research organizations that need to do that. We need also to still not forget to work on the fundamentals, right? So yes, you want to do compute, but what about the last mile connectivity? How do we still invest in internet connectivity that is accessible and reliable? How do we invest in energy, not just towards the data centers, but last mile energy? Because the more we have AI, the more even the sort of the simple devices begin to have some interesting capabilities. And so how do you ensure that even that particular end of the infrastructure is covered? We need to continue to build our capacities around financing. I think a lot of what you see today is resourced externally. And in the world that we are today, with sort of ODA shrinking, with sort of new geopolitics around international development financing, we need really to relook at how we resource these critical infrastructures, but also understanding this geopolitics, right? So I think for me, if you do not pay for it, chances are somebody owns it. So how do we ensure that we look at technology and technology infrastructure as a new capability that can be contested and can be colonized if we are not careful? Interesting, we have cables that are coming into our shores. Kenya has now, I think, we're going to have a seventh one. We saw what happened when Equiano went down on the other side, right? So a simple fiber cut under sea cable creates a challenge for the continent's connectivity. So how do we rectify that in a way that then we're not disrupted or we're not dependent on one channel, and that we have multiple options that ensures that we still are connected? And finally, I think for me, it's around governance, is how do we ensure that we do not necessarily jump on the bandwagon around regulations and legislations, because I have a sense a lot of the regulations and legislations are externally driven, and that I can see across the continent. But we need to figure out, yes, we need to govern these technologies, but we need to govern it from our own understanding or perspective based on the fundamental values that you've seen are enshrined in, for example, in the Africa AI strategy.
Absolutely. And I think the last point rings even more true if we recognize that this field of governance is new to everyone in the world, because we're speaking about emerging technologies. They're emerging, they're new to all the countries in the world. So we're not looking at past examples or best practices that have been around, tried and tested for many, many years or many decades. But we're looking at everybody experimenting in that field, which means that it's even more important for us to recognize that and do the same type of experimentation as a continent. I'd love to come back to the issue of lifelong learning. You've just given extremely useful examples in terms of the understanding that we have to build across our professions, the professions that are really at the core of making use of the digitization and the innovation in the space that is being developed, whether that's telemed, whether that's edtech, whether that's technology in the agriculture space. For instance, we need farmers, doctors, teachers, you said, who also have a core understanding of technology and what the various emerging technologies have to offer. I was speaking to a child psychologist over the weekend, and she said, as little children, we develop our seven senses, the five that are known plus the two additional that speak to how we're positioned in space. We develop those seven senses from the moment that we're born. And now we're having new technologies that actually challenge these senses, that actually teach us that we can't always trust our senses, which means that we have to educate our children from as early as possible to also engage with these technologies, to understand what they do and how they change the world around us, which is not something that we're good with or good at the moment. How can we integrate this lifelong learning in our existing ways of teaching that we have on the continent? We still have major challenges when it comes to foundational learning and numeracy, literacy and numeracy across the continent. So how can we now bring this completely new world into our curricula, into our teaching spaces, also recognizing that the teachers are quite often not yet well versed in these technologies?
I think the most interesting part, right, of this technology, it's duality, right? That yes, it's creating challenges, but also I think for me it can be an opportunity for improving learning outcomes or how we deliver education. So I think for me, the first thing is mindset. We need really to change our mindset around learning and learning outcomes. That this notion of this sort of conveyor belt education model that is linear is no longer relevant, if I may add, for this kind of technological revolution. And so I think it's a mindset. One, I think the second one is to shift the culture of learning and education, because the current culture of learning and education, as you know, is tied towards examinations. It's tied towards papers and certificates, and it's never about the learner, right? So the current education system does not take responsibility for the learner and the outcomes and how they prosper in society. It's very much around credential, right? So and I feel that's where the challenge is. So if we shift the culture of learning and education, then it means if the education system is sort of kind of as a metrics tied to student success or learner success and how they prosper in society, then we become immediately tuned into the current frequency of this industrial revolution, which means we need a lot of applied learning. They need a lot of flexibility. We've seen where, for example, students in Africa, which is weird, right? So students in Africa are not being allowed, for example, to use these large language models in class. Yet, in a university that I was part of in the US, it is part of education. You're actually encouraged to do that because then, in a sense, it helps you in terms of being very analytical. It helps you understand many things. And so you can see the disconnect, right? And yet, these two fellows, right? So the African and the American are supposed to compete in a labor market. The third part, I think, is the rapid pace of change. As we know, before you do a curriculum and then approve it and then get it rolled out, things change and moved, right? So these 4-year cycles, 3-year cycles are not working. I think a lot of us have been thinking when I was still in academia, that's just a year ago, we're thinking about micro-learning, right? So, or micro-credentialing. So that it's very much nuanced based on the opportunities that exist now. But then you can incrementally stack it. So you can stack your learning and your credentials in a way that, yes, at the end of the day, at the end of the 4 years, you can, yes, evolve or emerge out of with a degree or a master's. But then it doesn't mean that at the end of the master's that your education is irrelevant. It means that that education pathway becomes so iterative that it recognizes the current rapid pace of change and shifts that are very much nonlinear And I think for me, that's what I really believe the continent needs to think, that we need to get out of this current model. We need to resource more education institutions in a way that they become more agile. We need to rethink our credit scoring, because sort of the credit credentialing that is based in hours of learning does not necessarily make sense anymore. Because with AI, you can create very different pathways for different learners, because then not all learners are the same, and not all learners can be taught using the same method. And so with technology, we can have very different methods, but the same outcomes that are more focused on our learner is useful or can engage in society more meaningfully.
100%. And again, I think that's where governments really can also play a leading role in terms of
Exactly.
recognizing stack learning credentials, right? When they call for positions to be filled, when they call for RFPs to be filled as part of procurement, to ensure that there is a recognition that diplomas are just as good as a master's degree, for instance, if you stack them right and if you see that agile progression and learning.
Exactly.
Is
Because ultimately it's about what they can do. And that's hardly, and you hardly see that, right? So ultimately your credentials will get you into the room or will get you the job, but then ultimately you have to deliver. And so
yes.
that for me is a trade-off, right? So how do we get learners who can deliver? Because this is where we live right now, where we really must be productive. And for a data point, and this is something that I just want to bring in, is that even for a country that has 42% internet connectivity, which is interesting, we are still the country that spends most of its time on social media, right? So at an average of 4 hours and 13 minutes. So it raises a lot of questions, right? So should we be going for 100% connectivity, or should we be thinking about productivity? Because clearly,
Yes.
if you have young people spending 4 hours, 13 minutes online, it means access is not an issue. It means potentially cost is not an issue. It's simply about productivity. So what do they need to have in sort of in front of them for them to then convert the social media use and time into something that is very productive? So sometimes this is what I am kind of struggling with. And these are national average, right? It's not about a Nairobi scenario. It's a national scenario.
Fascinating. I didn't know that statistic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And at the same time, the statistic then also brings us back to the point that you raised before, right? That we're discouraging our learners from using AI powered tools, not just LLM, but beyond that. If they're spending 4.5 hours on average on social media, it means that they're engaging in an environment where it is so critical to understand what actually powers what I see, what powers disinformation, misinformation, how do the algorithms work, but also how can I use it productively to actually get greatest value out of it? How can I position myself, my products, my business? Absolutely.
Yeah, totally agree.
So definitely lots of challenges. Before we speak about solutions, allow me to come back to one challenge that you raised, which is the financing challenge. And that is, of course, not unique to the digital space, to the technology space. Financing, cost of capital continues to be a massive issue for the continent. As Africa Practice, we've recently started to look at what drives the cost of capital, and we can see that a biased perception and a biased media sentiment and media reporting plays a very critical role in driving up the cost of capital for the continent. It's a massive challenge that really hampers our ability to move as quickly as we want to. Are there any unique solutions that you've come across, even at micro level, that you think that's something we need to look into as a continent? That's something we need to explore further.
No, I think it's, and this is something that I think we over or we do not necessarily consider, is that especially from a government side, and this is a lesson I think from Kenya, is that if you really want to build a robust, resilient technology and innovation ecosystem, you have to work with the private sector. There's no other way to do this. And unfortunately, the kind of, and I think it's a design challenge, that the sort of trajectory around designing, whether it's digital master plans or digital ecosystems, have very much been anchored around traditional financing and resourcing sort of models, right? Whether it's the big banks and loan structure, restructuring these loans. And so you realize that then it does not necessarily speak to resilience and sustainability. And so I think for me, for example, if you look at how Kenya today has six submarine cables, it was very much a government providing the enabling environment for private sector to do what they do best, right? Come in a stable, environment, a business environment, and invest. The other part, of course, is, and we always underestimate, and I call it the cost of democracy. That private sector can only thrive where there's democratic values and principles, and so you need private sector to be able to operate in a way that then they can operate without political interference, that they feel the investment as safe, that there's a free and independent press, that a lot of what they do gets covered and featured, and so that cost of democracy, I do not think we sort of speak a lot about, and I feel and if you look at the countries, honestly, that thrive around technology, let's be honest, look at them, they're very much democratic, right? South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and so I think people do not necessarily see this. So if you put a democratic lens on top of it, then you see it, where a startup can actually build a startup without necessarily having, some politician clamping it down, keeping the internet open, right? So we've seen some other countries have been shutting down the internet, but you've seen for Kenya, and the president has been very clear that this is somewhere that we will never go to. The issues around sandboxes, right? So for me, for example, sandbox is a government puts out a sandbox, but then, private sector has the opportunity to test the innovation at scale within an environment that allows experimentation and protects citizens. And that whole notion is a cost of democracy. And I think for me, that's what we do not do more. The third part, and this is something that I think, and I hope that we can explore collaboratively, is now that we have a diaspora that seem to be very much wanting to be engaged with the continent with remittances, pension funds that require a reimagination, right? So pension funds cannot just be investing in real estate. When there's new opportunities around technology, we have sportsmen and athletes. If you look at in the US or in the UK or sort of developed economies, where sportsmen are the biggest VCs or actors are the biggest VCs. So how do we get folks in the creative economy sports, especially Africa, where we have footballers, now in Europe, Kenyan runners winning everything all over the place with Ethiopians, being able to invest in these new areas. So I think basically what I'm saying is that there's new opportunities and potentials for resourcing that are very much African, with an increasing budding, growing middle class. So how do we ensure that we can re-engineer the thinking around these investments? How do we incentivize that with tax breaks or rebates so that they can begin to invest in technology and technological innovations?
We definitely have to schedule a second podcast episode, I think, with you. I'd love to go a lot deeper into some of the issues you just mentioned. Fascinating. Thank you. But I fully agree. And I love hearing the optimism in your voice, really, as well as the vision. And at the same time, it's not blue sky thinking. You're speaking about very real opportunities. We know that sports and entertainment is a real opportunity on the continent that has been discarded by many people for many decades. But it's live, it's vibrant, it's thriving, and it has something to offer globally. So you're speaking about very real opportunities that we can tap into. And at the same time, you're also speaking about policy innovations that Kenya, for instance, has been leading. You have a very successful sandbox approach in Kenya that has also enabled, particularly in the financial sector, has enabled cross-border collaboration from sandbox to sandbox and really driven a lot of the policy innovation across the continent. So you're pointing at very real examples here that we can take up. So thank you for that.
No problem.
I'd love to just as a sort of to finish off our podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Number one, what is the next critical engagement opportunity for the continent where we collectively have an opportunity to drive this vision forward in very real terms? And secondly, I'd love to hear from you. What is your vision for the continent in not in 5 years, 10 years, but where do you think we should be in 1 year time? Because as you said, the world is moving at rapid pace. So vision statement for 1 year only.
I think for me, and I said collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. I think we need to go beyond this race mentality. That unlike the previous technologies or revolutions, I think this one will be a collaborative venture. And so I think for me, we need in the next 1 year to move beyond, the Kenya, the Ghana, the Rwanda, South Africa mentality of being the first to do X or the first to do Y, to this is the continent. This is what we need to do around compute and how we need to share that, because we need workloads. We need to figure out what sovereignty means within our context. We need to consolidate our talent across the value chain. We need, honestly, and for me, in the next 1 year, we need more use cases. How is AI impacting, improving people's lives? So this is something I think people like Africa Practice, I think, can help. Because the more people understand how AI, not in the abstract, right? So we're not trying to create self-driving cars here, right? Very much improving food systems, very much improving people's lives, very much improving health outcomes, very much around genomics, very much around poverty, very much around the little nonsense things such as dairy, and these are use cases we have, improving dairy value chains. How is AI benefiting aspects of people's lives in every facet in the continent? I think for me, in the next 1 year, if we do not do that, then the negative aspects of technology or AI is what people will remember, right? So because people remember the memes, the misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes, and not necessarily understand or live up to the promise of what this technology can bring in their lives.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Thigo. I think we all have our work cut out. I'm excited about the collaboration element, most definitely.
Yeah.
I think, I couldn't agree more, and I think I speak for everyone who's part of our audience as well. That collaboration is definitely what we all signed up for. So thank you very much for that. I know you're at the front line. You used that term yourself earlier. So our best wishes as well to the front line. And I will connect with your team afterwards, maybe to see if we could also make the link to the handbook that you made available to diplomats.
No,
if we can also link that in the chat, I'm sure our audience would love to see that.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you so much. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you so much. We'll connect soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.